Sophie's explained a little bit who I am, but not so much why I'm here. Perhaps it's because I'm a doctor, but I think I'm certainly not as experienced as many of the people you've heard from already today, and nor am I an expert in cancer. But what I am an expert in, to some extent, is in neglect and in research and development for neglected diseases. So Mike's talked a little bit about the commercial model and the lessons that we might take from IT and licensing. And I'm here to talk about the lessons, potentially, that the field of rare cancers could take from neglected disease research. And I say lessons, but it's really not lessons at all, because that's quite hubristic, but it's more some shared experience or some examples from the field that I am interested in that may be applicable across the spectrum of research and health. So just the first example of why I'm here, to talk a little bit about or give context to how much is actually invested in research and development of new health technologies. So overall, 270 billion. Cancer, 15. Rare cancer, not really sure, but probably specifically perhaps 3 billion. And neglected diseases as a whole, about 3 billion too. So perhaps that's the other reason that I'm here, is just we have the same size circles. And as you heard from Ian Fraser earlier, I mean, $3 billion sounds like a lot of money annually to invest in research and development. It's and probably even surprising for you to hear, or may not, that that much money is invested specifically in research around rare cancers and in these diseases like HIV and malaria and tropical diseases that we consider to be quite neglected. But as you heard from Ian, that's only just a little bit more than Australia spends on vitamins every year. So does it matter then that these circles are the same size? And why are they the same size? And again, to come back to what Ian said earlier, it all comes back to the money. So I mean, this is obviously not an economics lesson, and I'm not going to go through sort of the principles of capitalism, I guess, but really just to set up a really basic framework that lets us understand neglect on the one hand and access on the other. And this really simple framework, from an R&D and access perspective, helps us to see clearly why neglected diseases are neglected and which are more neglected than others. And at the same time, in the spectrum of rare cancer, what research is likely to be funded and where are you likely to run into access issues. So to talk about, I guess, to explain a little bit about what I mean by neglected diseases, talking about diseases like malaria, like dengue, like neglected tropical diseases like worm infections, onchocerciasis or river blindness, leishmaniasis, and a whole host of other things that you may or may not have heard of, from leprosy through to trachoma, which we have or is an endemic problem here in Australia. So in the case of malaria, it's not a disease of few people, of a small population. I mean, around about 1 million people a year die from malaria, 95% of them children under 5. And in terms of infections, it's in the hundreds of millions. But the reason that it's neglected is because of the price side. So the volume's high, but the people that get malaria can't afford the treatments, they can't afford the nets, and they're not going to pay big bucks for a vaccine. And that comes down to both the people and the governments in many of those countries. So that's, one example of neglect where you have a huge population, but simply not the economic capacity to pay a price that's going to encourage anyone to develop a new vaccine. or a new drug just purely out of expecting a financial return. In the case of rare cancers, the price, well, the capacity to pay of the health system here is relatively high, but the volume of people that have it, or the population for many of these rare cancers is so small that there's less likely to be research targeted at the particularly rare spectrum of the rare cancers. And for the products that do come out of that research, the price needs to be exceptionally high in order to justify the company's investment. And then the double whammy is, for example, in HIV. Now, HIV in a whole, in adult population, is not neglected in terms of developing new drugs. It occurs around the world. Health systems, including in Australia and the US and the UK, are prepared to pay significant amounts of money for HIV drugs for adults. But because of those advanced health, or because of the sort of success of those advanced health systems, HIV in children is almost unheard of in the West. And so because of good antenatal screening, prevention of mother-to-child transmission, we essentially don't have HIV in kids. And so you have a very small population, because only a few children on a global scale get HIV. All of those people are in the developing world, and so they're not going to pay. So that's the sort of the double whammy of neglect. And so I guess to talk about what this means for rare cancers, really to talk about some of the solutions that we use in the neglected disease field that will come back to, I guess, a lot of the things that, or a lot of the issues that were raised before by Ian and by Mike. So really there are three key solutions to the challenge of insufficient investment in research for neglected diseases. It's public and philanthropic funding, it's product development partnerships, and there are other innovative mechanisms. And I'll come back a little bit to, or I'll come back to each of those sequentially. So again, this is who funds research for neglected diseases. There's not here so much to look at the numbers, but just to talk about what the consequence of neglect is and what it looks like, or what research funding looks like when you have a disease that affects, or that a disease that is commercially attractive versus one that isn't, and when you have a disease that is of high public health importance versus one that's not. So the picture for neglected disease, basically, it's 2/3 funded by the public sector, for example, the NHMRC here in Australia, but in particular, the National Institutes of Health in the US as the largest funder. It's then funded about 20%, a little bit over, by philanthropic organisations, in particular the Gates Foundation, which is the majority of that. And then around about 12% by the pharmaceutical industry. And some of that's in areas that sort of has some commercial overlap, some of it's CSR, some of it's being incentivised by the existence of these product development partnerships that I'll come back to. As you see, about 2/3 of it comes just from three funders, well, essentially two funders plus the industry. So when this is in, or to transfer this to the example of rare cancer, you just flip the industry and the philanthropic investment. So the public sector invests about the same. It's always going to fund the early stage research and the research of public health benefit. Industry gets involved when there's money to be made. So why is this, I guess, important? We heard before about orphanisation through molecular stratification, and basically that as cancer treatments become more and more specialised, as we talk about patient populations who are smaller and with increasingly complex treatments, research for rare cancers will tend to move down that spectrum towards the picture of neglect that we're talking about. So then how to best utilise that sort of public and philanthropic investment, or attract more philanthropic investment, and make sure that it's targeted at the priorities that will bring the greatest benefit. So one of those is product development partnerships. And really coming back to, for example, the example of the ROS1 non-small lung cancer, and how do you make sure that amongst all that bottom-up research, you get some sort of strategic focus on an area of significant need for a small patient population. Product development partnerships are relatively new, as in the last 20 years, development in neglected diseases. And basically they're a vehicle for strategic funding. They may do research themselves, they may just coordinate research, they do advocacy, and they basically bring together public health expertise, funding from the philanthropic and public sector, and industry, pharmaceutical companies to actually do, and academics to do the research. And in the case of rare cancers, the numbers here aren't so important. In the case of rare cancers, one of the key things that they may be able to bring about is the lateral transfer that we were talking about before. So for example, moxidectin was a drug that is used in, or like ivermectin, used for treating worm infections in animals. It also happens to be very effective in treating river blindness, onchocerciasis. But it's not registered for that need. So the idea, or the benefit of a product development partnership is to say, hey, hang on, we have this drug over here, industry, which was made because the industry saw a market in agricultural pharmaceuticals, and say, well, no one's actually going to fund the studies to prove that it is safe to use in people, especially because those people aren't going to pay any money for it once it's delivered. So we'll do that. It won't take very much money. We'll go out to some philanthropic people, maybe the Gates Foundation, and we'll prove that this can work and that it's safe. So that's one key benefit. And the other one is the target product profiles. So as Wendy was talking about earlier, you need to make sure that the patient needs are addressed right from the start. And that's one of the things that product development partnerships do, is to basically set up what's called I'm sure many of you know, a target product profile to say, right, any treatment that's going to be successful for this has to have features A, B, and C. Ideally, it would have X, Y, and Z as well. It has to be able to be registered for a price of less than X dollars a dose. And these are the licensing strategies that we could put in place to achieve that. And this is the restrictions that we would put on to ensure access once it's registered. And I'm getting the wind up, so I'll just flick really through one more quick slide, and one is just not to explain any of these in detail, but maybe just as things to think about, the priority review vouchers, of which there is one already in the US for rare paediatric diseases, which says if you register a product for a rare paediatric disease or for a neglected disease, there are two different programs, we'll review your next blockbuster drug really quickly, and you'll get an extra 4 months, which in the case of, for example, Gilead's new Hep C treatment is about worth about $4 billion in return for that. And so then anyone that can register a drug for these new indications, so for example, in the case of moxidectin, will get that voucher, and then they can either use it on a drug that they have, if they do have a blockbuster, or sell it to someone else. There are a lot of issues with that scheme, but it is one way to encourage that lateral transfer and industry participation. Global Health Innovative Technologies Fund is just a way to bring governments and philanthropics and PDPs and industry together. And the Health Investment Fund is what sort of Mike was talking about before, about the value-based or value-sharing model, where you use, or impact investment, another sort of equivalent concept, where you're basically trying to attract some sort of capital that wants a double bottom line to say, oh, I want to get some return on my money, but I'm also interested in social good. So here's my money to help do these trials, and if you can prove that you're going to save the health system money by, introducing this treatment for cancer X, then you can pay me back, or the government will, for example, pay me back some of the money that they will save. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.